All right, so I had left off kind of introducing the notion of supply here and how I would teach it. So the important thing with supply is to get in the mindset of someone who is producing something. So the thing that I always like to think about is whether I would be producing a scarf or something like that. So if you line everyone up, all the potential producers of a product, and say, if the price is $10, how many would be produced? If the price is 15, how many would be produced? Then you derive the market supply curve. That's a curve indicating the total quantity of a good that all producers in a competitive market would produce at each price, holding the stuff constant, right? So you've got holding input prices, technology, and other variables constant. So again, if we think about that regression equation, what happens when you run a regression, which you guys don't have to really know, is it allows you to hold the other stuff constant. So I mentioned some textbooks use the law of supply, some do not. This book does. So the law of supply says there's a direct relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of a good. If the price rises, quantity supplied rises. If the price falls, quantity supplied falls, holding other variables constant. Now the reason sometimes books don't use the law of supply is because if you think about like hunting licenses, 100 or whatever will be supplied in each town regardless of the price. So we're more likely to have kind of weird supply curves. All right, again, there is a difference between changes in quantity supplied and changes in supply. Change in quantity supplied is a movement along the curve, and a change in supply is a shift of the entire curve. So if we think about this, let's say at point A, whatever this price is, this is the quantity supplied, higher price, higher quantity supplied. That's a change in quantity supplied. A change in supply is when the whole curve increases. So there's still this relationship. Is the price goes up, the higher is the quantity supplied. It's just more is supplied at every single price. And then that's what a decrease in supply looks like. Now, if you're like me and you've taught this before, you might be glazing over a little bit, but I encourage you to stop and pay attention to this part. It is super easy to confuse the supply curve. The reason it's easy is if you think up and down, you're going to get messed up forever. So if you look, an increase in supply, it's actually down, right? It looks like it goes down. So it's going to mess you up. Think right and left. An increase is a shift to the right, a decrease is a shift to the left. You will never have a problem in that case. All right, what are things that can shift the entire curve? Number one, input prices. We'll go through an example of this together in my examples, my practice video. But basically, if you think about like a bicycle, if the price of carbon steel, I don't know, my husband's super into this stuff. If the price of the metal in the bike goes up, then the quantity supplied of bikes will shift to the left. Okay, and the opposite. If an input's cheaper, then the supply curve will shift to the right. Your book is super obsessed with taxes, which is not usually put in this chapter. And the other thing it's kind of obsessed with is government regulation. So I'm going to sort of not talk about that as much as technology here. Technology only goes in one direction, hopefully, unless there's like a natural disaster or something. So if there's an improvement in technology, supply shifts to the right. Usually that's what we see. Government regulation, if there's an increase in government regulation, we would see the supply shift to the left. Number of firms, if there's more firms, supply shifts to the right. If there's less firms, it shifts to the left. Now this seems really weird to mention, but when we talk about perfect competition, we're going to draw changes in supply as firms enter and exit, and it's going to end up being important. Substitutes in production is not something I like to teach. It's very confusing. If you start thinking there's substitutes in consumption and substitutes in production, it gets really, really difficult for students. However, this is a graduate class, so we will talk about it. It will be included. Basically, if you think about as a producer, like let's say you're producing corn, you could produce corn or soybeans in your field. So if the price of soybeans decreases, the supply of corn might increase. It's actually what happened with toilet paper in the pandemic. Like, I don't know, is it Kimberly-Clark that makes toilet paper? They were able to shift like paper towel machines to make more toilet paper, so they could kind of shift between the two. Like I say, your book is really obsessed with taxes, and it puts taxes right away in this chapter. At an undergraduate level, I probably would skip over it, but as I said, this is a graduate level course, so we will discuss taxes. Basically, an excise tax, which is a per unit tax, shifts the supply curve to the left. That's all you really need to think about. If there's an increase in taxes, it shifts it to the left. And then the last one here is producer expectations, okay? And this is interesting. If you look at these supply shifters, with the exception of substitutes in production, none of them are on a demand shifter, right? So if I ask you, something changes, it's usually either a supply shift or a demand shift. Expectations are both, okay? So if a producer, let's say a producer of, let's say toilet paper, actually. If the producer believes the price will increase in the future, supply today will decrease. Why? Because they'll wait to sell it in the future. Let's think about that housing market again. So like if any of you who own houses like I do, I'm a supplier of my house. I'm a potential supplier. If I expect the price next year to be high, I'm not likely to supply that house today. I'm going to wait. If we expect the price to decrease next year, well, I'm going to sell that today, right? So again, if we think about 2008, what was happening is we saw a twofold change in the housing market. So prices were dropping, right? We were all expecting prices to drop. Consumers were not buying them, so there was a shift to the left of demand. There was actually a shift to the right of supply. So suppliers of houses were like, oh my God, I got to sell this right now, right? And the simultaneous shift actually caused the price to drop. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially true in things like the stock market. So suppliers of stocks are not companies, right? It's most of the time, unless it's an initial stock offering. It's people who own the stock. So like Walgreens stock, my husband owns some Walgreens stock. He's a supplier of Walgreens stock. So if we imagine we expect the price of Walgreens stock to increase soon, demand for that stock is going to increase today. Supply today is going to decrease, right? My husband's going to hold on to that. The expectation alone is enough to increase the price. So what I would invite you guys to think about is that Beeple, example, $69 million. So was there a supply change in Beeple products? It's really hard to say, right? How much is this guy producing? So the important thing to think about with the art market is there's two types of markets. There's the primary market and the secondary market. The primary market is like you go to this guy and buy his art. The secondary market is where we see supply shifts. So that's when someone has bought his product, his art, and then they're going to resell it. Okay? So I think the thing that happened in this market is so demand for these NFTs went up, these pieces of art. And I also think because people expected the price of those to go up, supply went down. Okay? So if you're holding a Beeple, you can tell I think it's ridiculous to talk about this. If you're holding a Beeple and you think that the price is going to increase, you hold on to that today. So what we see is a big demand and then a drop in supply and then the price increases. It's important to mention, at least two of you guys said you're excited to talk about elasticity. The other thing with art is that it's a very inelastic good. So price changes are super intense anyway when we see the curve shift. All right. So this is your book showing you what happens when there's a tax. This is the supply of, this is gasoline without a tax. You add a tax, shifts to the left. Okay? Notice how they have an up arrow. I do not like that. Think about a left arrow here. All right, we're going to skip through this one right now. I don't really care about the difference. All right, so now we're going to turn to the mathematics behind this. Okay, so a supply function looks something like this. The quantity supplied of a good is the dependent variable, and then we've got all the things that impact it. So you can see the price of a good impacts it, and then all these other things. So what's happening here, when we get a supply curve, it talks about there's a direct relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied of that good, holding these constant. So basically, it's like you put values into this, with 1,000, 2,000, whatever it is. Put them in, hold it constant, and then you just let this fluctuate. And that's a supply function. We will go through this mathematically together. But it's important to look, again, we can look at the signs of these things. So let's see. W is the input, and P is the technology, or I'm sorry, that's an R. Basically, let's just go through an example. Let's say this is our supply function here. It's the price of a good, probably the price of a related good, and technology. I actually don't know what this is, but it doesn't really matter. You put values into here, and you get the amount that's supplied. All right, again, when we look back at this, it looks like, because this is the dependent variable, normally we would put this on the y-axis and these on the x-axis. That's not actually what we do. What we're graphing when we graph a supply curve is the inverse supply function. So I'll go through an example of this in the future. All right, producer surplus is the amount producers receive in excess of the amount necessary to induce them to produce the good. Basically, what is the minimum price you would accept? $10? Okay. If you get paid $15, that is a producer surplus of $5. So you can graph the producer surplus. Whoops, I went back. You can imagine like a demand curve here. The producer surplus is this part down here. All right, we all know where the equilibrium is. It's the intersection of the demand and supply curves. If the price is higher than that, then there is going to be a mismatch between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. If the price is low, there will be a mismatch. So the equilibrium price is like Goldilocks, perfect bowl of porridge is the perfect price, everyone's happy. Let's just look at this graphically. If the price was higher than, so this is equilibrium. If the price is pH, too high, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, that is a surplus, too many goods. Right now, if you go to like Target, you will see there's a surplus of swimsuits, right? Too many, they made too many this year. So what happens to the price when there's a surplus? Price will fall. Okay, that's your surplus. If the price is too low, if it's below the market clearing price, notice how I just called it the market clearing price. That's another word that we use. It clears the market. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. That is a shortage. There are probably shortages of, I don't know, Super Bowl tickets this year. Like they're not going to let that many people in and everyone wants to go. So what tends to happen is we see pressure on the price to go up. Your textbook actually has a really interesting example of a college graduation where there's this weird secondary market and seats at graduation were going for $400. If there's a shortage, if the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, there's pressure for the price to increase. All right, so I'm going to pause here. I think we can wrap this up with one more video for the week.